The year is 1919. Harold Lloyd blows off his hand. Hollywood gets their first ever black filmmaker. The first openly gay characters appear on screen, and Germany begins to get funky with their Expressionist movement. This is Journey Through Cinema, where I break down notable films and cinematic achievements from each film year. On February 5th, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith all band together to launch United Artists. United Artists was this brilliant idea by four legends to wrestle control of their pictures away from the producers by, becoming producers.
So when did the nut take over the nut house?
I joke, but that was actually more or less said by Metro Pictures head Richard Rowland. But it's a little more complicated than that. The four founders had learned of a plan to merge some of the bigger studios and lock in exhibition prices and more aggressive actor-director contracts. This was not just an act of personal preservation, but also an attempt to stave off a growing monopoly in the entertainment market. United Artists' first picture would be His Majesty the American, starring Douglas Fairbanks. A movie that, for the most part, rehashed a lot of the popular trends of Fairbanks' films. You had a foreigner, a fish out of water story, and it relied a lot on Fairbanks' silent comedy and athleticism. It didn't break a lot of new ground, but that was the point. It was supposed to be safe and familiar. The same went for Mary Pickford, who had just closed out her contract with First National with three massive hits: Daddy Longlegs, which became the third highest grossing film of the year, Hearts of the Hills, and The Hoodlum. All three leaned heavily into her little girl character. And yes, she still was being typecast as a little girl at the oh-so-youthful age of 27. That may explain why she was so frustrated with her first film for United Artists, Pollyanna, which premiered in 1920. It was extremely familiar to the point that both the director, Paul Powell, and Pickford, they both disliked the overly played-out script. It features a little girl who, after her ailing father dies, is sent away to live with her rich aunt. If you follow the historical parts of this channel, that may sound like pretty much every other Pickford film. It's made all the more awkward when Pickford was paired with an actual child actor. This only served to bring attention to her age and completely break the suspension of disbelief. Like His Majesty the American, the audience welcomed this familiarity and turned it into a smash hit. Both movies, they functioned like this greatest hits album for their actors. United Artists would rise through the 20s to become a powerhouse of the industry, no doubt helped by the four core artists who were among the most popular names in the industry. D.W. Griffith's first film for the studio would be Broken Blossoms, while Charlie Chaplin's first film, it wouldn't arrive until all the way in 1923 with A Woman in Paris. In March, Oscar Micheaux would premiere his first film, The Homesteaders. This is the first feature film directed by an African-American director. This would earn him the moniker of the first black director, or the black auteur, or the great and the only. I like that one. It makes him sound like he's the Wizard of Oz. Now you may be thinking, hold up now. You already said there was a black-owned studio, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And yes, I did. But I neglected to mention that those movies were all directed pretty much entirely by Harry Grant, a white director. So even though they were produced by black producers and starred black actors and actresses, they still did not have someone who was African American behind the camera. The Homesteader is unfortunately now lost to time, but Oscar Micheaux would build himself a very impressive library over the years, including his landmark cultural touchstone, Within Our Gates. And he's still a great candidate for someone who deserves his own video. Please let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to see that in the future. June 30th saw the release of Different from the Others, the first film to openly portray homosexuality. Back in the 1910s, Germany was still extremely anti-gay and had many anti-homosexuality laws that allowed them to actually jail offenders. It also, coincidentally, had a lack of censorship laws, mostly due to their defeat in the First World War. It created this perfect storm to breathe this film into existence, as director and producer Richard Oswald made the film this social call to end imprisonment and discrimination against those who were gay. It was a landmark for many reasons, as it sought to humanize a group that wasn't so much marginalized as, thrown in the deepest, darkest cell and left to rot. It featured the first depictions of a gay relationship, first depictions of a gay club, and the first gay main character. I guess if you don't count Philibus. Philibus was this movie about a lesbian sky pirate who's playing this game of cat and mouse with a detective. So I'm not sure if you can call her the main character. Also, the Italians, they were a little nimble-footed about all this, and they never did really directly confirm the character's sexuality. Not really, although it was kind of obvious. Different from the Others is grounded in a stark reality, as it reaches to make the characters very relatable and sympathetic. That was their goal, not having them be these cartoon characters. It was meant to express the very real tragedy of the times. It tells the story of a talented violinist who is outed and blackmailed for being gay, and lives in constant fear of being jailed from the anti-gay laws. The fact this movie still exists is kind of a marvel. It's another picture that the Nazi Party would later try to hunt down and destroy. It didn't help that the main character was both gay and Jewish, something I hear the Nazis are not very fond of. It avoided outright censorship only due to the upheaval in a post-war Germany, and it is nothing if not an example of the enduring power of art. Nevertheless, the film, it now only exists in fragments, with large sections missing, and really we are lucky to have even that. Overall, the film, it sort of had the opposite intended effect. Rather than abolishing anti-gay laws, it caused this big uproar and a bunch of protesting, and soon those pesky censorship laws were quickly put back in place, leaving Differ from the Others as this island of progressive ideals, ripe for rediscovery in the 21st century. August 25th saw the release of The Grimm Game, the first film to star Harry Houdini. Now, Houdini had previously starred in a film serial, The Master Mystery, but this was his first proper feature film. Houdini was already this famed master magician and escape artist, and for the most part, the entire plot of this movie, basically it just exists to highlight those skills with various scenes of Houdini being caught and captured, and then using his skills to escape, and then just to be captured again and escape again, and over wow his captors. That's basically the gist of the entire plot. However, it's at the climax of this film that it earns its reputation with a real-life mid-air collision between two airplanes. The finale sees Houdini tied up and suspended from one plane with another in hot pursuit. The two come up next to each other, and unfortunately a gust of wind causes one to just collide into the other, sending both crashing to the ground. The cameraman, Al Wilson, was kind enough to keep his camera rolling and following the action for all of our entertainment. Nobody died, by the way. I'm not that morbid. They all survived, thankfully. I mean, they're dead now. Just from time itself, withering them away, not from some giant fireball crash. No, they survived. They're good. Anyways, marketing reported that this was Houdini himself who was hanging from the aircraft during the crash, but most now cite that it was stuntman Robert E. Kennedy. Tom Cruise? Houdini ain't. Yet it meant that the film became this big piece of pop culture spectacle and only served to add to Houdini's total aura of just mystique. August 29th saw the release of The Miracle Man from director George Lone Tucker and starring Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney would become a master character actor, combining his skills of playing contorted villains with impressive makeup to transform him past recognition. The Miracle Man would become sort of his breakout film that would solidify him as a man willing to spend hours in the makeup chair or painfully hobble around with his knees in metal buckets. That's real, by the way. We'll get to that next year. Chaney would earn the nickname The Man with 1,000 Faces. One could see him as maybe a precursor to Johnny Depp or perhaps Bill Skarsgård of 1919. Also this year, Harold Lloyd would be hard at work on his new movie, The Haunted Spooks, when during a press event, he would be so convinced that a prop bomb wouldn't explode that he decided to light the fuse and found out. To his shock, yeah, prop bombs still indeed go boom. It's kind of ironic to me that this happened in a film that features a series of comedic sequences where his glasses character is trying to depart from this cruel world. The prop bomb, though, it ends up actually taking Lloyd's pointer and thumb. He would ignore his doctor's advice to find a new career and continue to act and perform his own stunts while wearing a prosthetic glove. This year, Lloyd also began the practice of test screening his movies. Test screening is the practice of showing a film to an early audience and then modifying it based on the response. It is a practice that still exists today. So if you think about it, it's not really Lloyd's worst year, but it certainly isn't his best year either. It could have been a lot worse.
It could have been worse, John. A lot worse.
Germany, meanwhile, was gearing up to leave its big mark on the cinematic landscape. It had put off trying to take over the world again for about 20 years and decided, hey, let's get a little wacky. The German Expressionist movement came into its prime a year later in 1920, but the bedrock was being formed here with Robert Reinhardt's directed movie Nerven, or Nerves. And no, I didn't bring up World War I just to kind of have an extra dig at Germany. No, I bring it up because Nerven expresses the end of World War I as this nervous epidemic by the German people. It is also a window into the psyche of the times. It's an expressionist look at how people were responding to their military loss with a turn to social reform and revolution. In a way, it's kind of this interesting window into a mindset that would set them up to accept fascism in the not-so-distant future. Yet, it's how this movie chooses to express those ideas that makes it so unique. It's focusing on the mental health of the masses, with scenes of artistic dramatization and larger-than-life sets. The movie would springboard many artists into the heyday, with such films as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Golem, and, of course, Nosferatu. But a larger breakdown of the movement will be saved probably for next episode. Getting back to stateside, Polish immigrant Max Fletcher would premiere 2 of his most popular characters. Out of the Inkwell would see the debut of Koko the Clown, while Feline Follies would see the first appearance of Felix the Cat. The character would be created by very young animator Otto Mesmer, and would be known only as Master Tom before earning his real name in The Adventures of Felix later this year. Lastly, we have legendary film director Erich von Strohiem, who would debut his very first directed film in Blind Husbands. He was known somewhat unkindly as the man everybody loves to hate. Hopefully that's because he played a lot of villains and not due to the content of his character. Blind Husbands could easily be confused for one of Cecil B. DeMille's popular infidelity dramas of the time. You have the wife of a doctor who's pursued by another man and then must choose between the affections of the 2 men. But it's in the final act that the movie shows Stroheim's early promise with a spectacular conclusion. They begin their ascent up the side of a steep mountain, and at the summit finally have to confront one another. Here you have all the lines of plot come together to create a series of interesting moral decisions that leave the audience on the edge of their seat as to what the characters will really do and if they'll fall prey to their base anger and fear. All of it was done with some convincingly slick cinematography and survivalist grit. It was a bold first foot forward after a pretty safe first 2 acts. And with that, we're going to move into the highest grossing film of the year. Now, you may all realize I didn't do a highest grossing video for 1919. Well, there's a good reason for that. Depressingly, this is the first year, and I think only year, that we're not going to have a highest grossing film because it no longer exists. The highest grossing movie is Lon Chaney's star vehicle, The Miracle Man. Only a 3-minute segment remains of a film that would pull in over $1 million. It had 2 significant runners-up. First, Mary Pickford's Daddy Longlegs, which saw a young girl who was sent off to school by a mysterious admirer. Second, Male and Female, from Cecil B. DeMille, a smash hit that would turn Gloria Swanson into a major sex symbol for the time. As for Miracle Man, we can only hope that, like many movies from this time, it is someday rediscovered again. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into Todd's top picks, where I break down my top picks for the best movies of this year. And it seems the further we get into this series, the more and more movies I have for this part. And so for today, I've got 6 selections. Fair warning, there will be moderate spoilers here, as I may get a little deep into events and plot. First, we have the Swedish crime epic, Sir Arnes Treasure, from director Mart Stiller. The film sees a group of Scottish mercenaries plotting to backstab the King of Sweden before they are caught and imprisoned. They break out and make their way to a frozen port, where they hear about Sir Arnes and his cursed gold that was looted from monks. The mercenaries plot to steal the treasure and end up murdering the entire family save for one girl, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the cursed gold. Arne's sole surviving daughter, Esselil, is sent away to live with caretakers. Later, the girl will find herself falling for one of the mercenaries who poses as a wealthy man who wishes to marry her to make amends for his crimes. This movie was kind of wild, and I was shocked it didn't appear on many best of the year lists. It really was a true hidden gem. Based on the novella The Treasure by Selma Lagerlöf, the movie expands a lot on points of the original story, fleshing out the mercenaries' motivation and managing to craft a brilliant sense of dramatic tension, taking the audience from sympathizing with the mercenaries to condemning them to really kind of fearing for Esselil's safety, especially as she's being conned into marrying one of the people who murdered her father. Okay, that's not great. In a lot of ways, this movie is carrying a lot of the principles of an Alfred Hitchcock film. The nature of Hitchcockian suspense is a man holding a gun under the table while the guy sitting across from him doesn't know that it's there. That's the basics of it. And here you see a lot of the same. We know about the mercenaries, but Esselil doesn't. And that's where the tension comes from. The film is doing this masterfully within the silent format, as conflicts are highly visual in nature. It isn't like some dramas from this time period that are trying to draw from limited title card exposition. This is from clear actions and reactions. It ends on a thrilling climax with a fight to control a ship frozen in the ice as our criminals make their getaway, all culminating in a tragic yet poetically satisfying conclusion. It's got the action, romance, crime, murder, and just general mayhem that you'd want to see from like a modern day blockbuster. This movie had it all. Number 5, different from the others. We already spoke some length about this film earlier in the video. I will reiterate, this is still a movie well worth seeing today. Not just as a window into a time of prejudice, but because it is also just a pretty damn good tragedy. Tragedies were very popular in the 1910s and the 1920s, far more so than today, where even the most hardened film will still try to find some silver lining or some pretty moral pearl. That's not at all what this is going for. This is an attempt by director Richard Oswald to put reality front and center, to make his subjects not some faceless gossip, but real people. It is serving an agenda, absolutely, but it's aiming for authenticity, as it was co-written by famed sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. And the film includes lines such as, "Love for one of the same sex is no less pure or noble than one of the opposite." Yeah, again, this was 1919, okay? Keep that in your head. Now, Magnus Hirschfeld was a gay Jewish man himself, and he later became the father of the early sexology movement in Germany. In my last video, there were quite a few people that pointed out his various shortcomings, and yeah, that's putting it mildly. And while medicine, and especially psychology, were often out of step and highly problematic compared to modern standards, it should not distract from the fact that Hirschfeld likely was one of the most progressive figures of his day. He's a complex figure in his own right, who can and has filled out hour-long videos. Here we're going to take a step back, though, and look at him simply through the lens of his contribution to film history, and outside of any of our modern moral privilege. Hirschfeld used the film as kind of his mission to preach tolerance, but also to seek a realignment and education on a larger scale. At this time, the gay community was such an isolated group, it really had no voice, and was kind of kept out of sight and out of mind. As a result, in media, there wasn't really a realistic depiction of them due to just kind of general pearl clutching. I've always said that I really don't care if a movie has a message, political or social. It really doesn't even matter if I agree with it or not. It is how a movie is delivering on that message that creates the compelling art. A movie that has something to say, however bold, will always be more interesting than one that's just a soulless repeat. It doesn't matter if that message really comes from progressivism or old-fashioned conservatism. Different from the others is a movie with something to say, and it gets it across even with the large parts of the movie missing. The characters are well-rounded, from their romantic flings to flashbacks of the orphanage to their struggle with the law. The goal here was first and foremost to humanize them, and because of that goal, a lot of these become actually good fleshed out characters. The relationship between the violinist Corner and his lover Silvers, that's kind of what makes this tragedy work. When the famed violinist is outed and put on trial, you can actively root for him, even when things go sideways. You are still invested in him finding a way out. And to me, it's because they put that effort into getting these characters authentic to the time period that this remains a very worthwhile piece of film history. Well worth discovering. Number 4, When the Clouds Roll By. This movie is what a big budget action comedy looked like for the 1910s. It's also an example of Douglas Fairbanks firing on all cylinders, from both his spectacular stunts, to his suave, goofy grin, to his action prowess, and even his romantic charm. This movie was also the directorial debut of one Victor Fleming. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he is the director of both The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Yeah, he would become a directing legend who made 2 of the highest grossing films of all time and 2 of the most beloved movies of all time. I would also add When the Clouds Roll By as his 3rd forgotten masterpiece. This is a film that turns Fairbanks into this wild Bugs Bunny of a man, as he goes from spectacular, just over-the-top comedic stunts to just high-budget action set pieces. And I may even go so far as to say this may be my favorite film from him yet. Here Fairbanks plays another over-the-top character as a man consumed by his superstitions. Like he can't break a mirror, he can't go under a ladder, that sort of thing. This makes for an easy-to-follow, lovable quirk that also makes for some easy comedic layups. The movie features the first instance of the rotating set with the walk-on-the-wall ceiling. This trick would be further popularized by Fred Astaire in the 1950s, and then later again by Lionel Richie on Dancing on the Ceiling in the 1980s. And then it would be back again with Nolan in 2010's Inception. This is a set piece as old as Hollywood itself. Most of all, the movie also features a very impressive climax that utilizes a mix of small models, sets, pool work, and backlit screens to bring this great flood to life. It features Fairbanks daringly sliding down poles, running up walls, and jumping off rooftops. He is very nearly ready for his full transformation into the king of the swashbucklers. This would happen next year with The Mark of Zorro. Stay tuned, I guess. A fantastically fun and upbeat movie. Well worth watching. So check that one out. Number 3. Broken Blossoms. Another day, another film from D.W. Griffith of Birth of the Nation infamy. And I know what you're thinking.
Move this man!
Yes, well, now before you get in all an uproar about our often drunken, abusive father of cinema, as he's often called, though I think they don't include the drunken and abusive part, typically, let me first bring newcomers up to speed. Birth of a Nation in 1915 is one of the most racist films ever made, but also changed the Hollywood landscape and largely ushered in the age of the feature film. An age TikTok is doing its best to kill 100 years later. entertainment kind of comes full circle. This was literally my very first film that I reviewed on this channel. I guess I wanted to start myself off by just kind of throwing myself in the deep end to see if I could swim. I do like myself a little old-fashioned punishment. Griffith's follow-up would be Intolerance, a film made as a response to the critics of Birth of a Nation. Now, contrary to popular belief, Birth of a Nation was actually highly divisive, with protests led against it by the newly formed NAACP. In response, Griffith made his true masterpiece with Intolerance, a movie about various people struggling with intolerance through the ages. Now, don't give him too much credit. He was trying to say that people were being intolerant to him, not that he was being intolerant to anyone else. Yeah, it's crazy. Fortunately, he kind of accidentally ends up arguing against himself. The movie itself was a technological marvel and a great window into prejudice across time, but also, kind of ironically, it noted how those with prejudice can completely be oblivious to it. That kind of reminds me of someone. Broken Blossoms concludes what I like to call the D.W. Griffith self-examination trilogy, 3 films that highlight his changing perspective, both on race relation, racism, and bigotry. A part of me likes to think that Griffith really was hurt by all the bad press and accusations, and I really do hope some of it sank in. Will I ever know for sure? Not really, but call me an optimist. But I like to think that people can maybe possibly change. Now, Broken Blossoms is still very flawed. Very. It has a white actor by the name of Richard Bartholomew. Richard Bartholomew in Yellowface as a character entirely based on stereotypes. Yet the film itself is one that is trying to look at race relationships more critically than Griffith really ever has before. It tells the story of a Chinese native that moves to London as a Buddhist missionary. He ends up befriending a physically abused daughter of a boxer, and he tries to show her kindness. When her father learns of this relationship, he nearly beats her to death. The monk then cares for her, nurses her back to health, only for her to return home and be murdered by her father in another drunken rage. When the monk finds her murdered on her bed and the father's just sitting in the other room drinking, he then has to make a choice if he's going to honor his Buddhist ways or take revenge. The movie is heavily melodramatic, very heavy as you can tell. Yet it shows a newfound maturity by Griffith with how he treats that relationship between the 2 leads of different culture and races. Now, it probably would have helped if he cast someone who is of actual Chinese ethnicity, but this is 1910s Hollywood, so one step at a time, baby steps here. In the end, I continue to find Griffith just a fascinating character, creating one of the most racist pieces of cinema of all times, yet also creating some of the greatest films of the 1910s. His progression in the material he was willing to cover in just a short 5-year window, it is really surprising, especially as he was still trying to develop film as a craft. And Griffith was not the sort of man to apologize. He never really did. He was never the sort of man to publicly self-reflect. So the only answers we will ever have into how he changed in this time, it's all written on celluloid. This makes Broken Blossoms a third piece in a larger whole, and a must-watch movie for anyone to get a well-rounded look at a very difficult auteur. Number 2, Jack Hughes. World War I, up until this point, was considered one of, if not the worst war fought in all of history. It had left a stain on Europe, with broken cities and lost lives. There were many war epics that were made during this time. There's once this critic I heard, and again, I don't remember who said it, but he said, all war epics are kind of just the same. Their message is always that war is hell. While that can often be true, I'm not entirely sure I agree. Jack Hughes is directed by Abel Grace, and is less of a war movie and more of a pacifist or anti-war movie. This would become one of the movies that truly defined him as a filmmaker. Now, a big weakness of this film is it does have a 3+ hour runtime, but that runtime also means that a good amount of it takes place outside the events of the war. The first half is yet another sort of infidelity drama. Edith is married to a man of a violent temper named Francis. When he finds out that she's in love with the poet Jean, he sends her away to his parents, where she ends up being raped by invading German soldiers. But wouldn't you know it, but Poet Jean and the mean-tempered Francis end up in the same battalion and form a close sense of camaraderie on the battlefield. It should be noted here that many scenes are shot in actual trenches on actual battlefields, leading to a historical authenticity that's pretty rare to find. Jean is discharged early and returns home to find that Edith now has a German daughter. He helps raise her, which only re-triggers Francis's suspicions and jealousy when he returns. It's in the relationship of these 2 men that the movie is actually at its strongest. Francis is disgustingly violent, but there are times where you see that there's just the smallest sliver of a better man that can shine through. You see his potential in moments of silent friendship before he again turns violent and cruel. You see the softness of Jean, but also his equally despicable actions to try and steal away the wife of the man who's become his comrade, if not his friend. Now, infidelity dramas, they were everywhere. They were a dime a dozen at this time. But this was one where it focused less on who got the girl and more on the relationship between the two men, which is far more interesting than just another movie where the woman's there just to be treated as the basic prize. Yet it is in the conclusion that the film is most poignant. The famous March of the Dead, where a PTSD raving Jean sees the soldiers of the Great War rising from their graves to march the streets in a single solitary proclamation of "I accuse." Jean then challenges those around him who stayed home or couldn't fight, asking if they are worthy of their sacrifice. It is a theme that would be repeated nearly 100 years later in Steven Spielberg's own Saving Private Ryan. How much is a life worth? How much is the weight of all of them? And can you ever measure up to what was given? It is a powerful message and perhaps the most resonant way to close out the 1910s. This movie would likely be my number one if not for the simple fact of its bloated runtime. Even with those 3 hours in mind, I beg you to take the time to watch it. With great dynamic characters, authentic debates on the merits of war, and kind of a killer romantic triangle, it all really comes together with that ending, that final march that will not soon be forgot. Number 1. Male and female. Cecil B. DeMille, at this point, he'd found a very profitable niche. His infidelity dramas were doing gangbusters, from Old Wives to New, For Better, For Worse, Don't Change Your Husband, Why Change Your Husband? People seem to like that his movies were not outright scandalous, but still challenging enough as moral pieces that usually ended on this safe, grass is greener on the other side message. Cecil B. DeMille probably didn't start this trend, but many other filmmakers took it up because of him. It became a staple of this time period. Male and Female is likely his best film of this genre. So far, I still am on this journey after all. Male and Female is still about social impropriety, but instead of focusing on couples' shenanigans, it covers a far more interesting topic for the 1910s, class. If you have ever seen the movie Triangle of Sadness from 2022, it's pretty close to being an outright remake. Male and Female tells the story of a butler who falls in love with a sexy, rich aristocrat who looks down on him due to their different social standing. Once their crew becomes shipwrecked and stranded on a small island, they suddenly find they are no longer living in a society.
You know, we're living in a society. We're supposed to act in a civilized way.
Social class becomes obsolete and turned on its head. It means nothing. Their entire survival becomes reliant on the butler, who with his sharp instincts rises to become the leader of their little castaway tribe. This societal role reversal within the film is kind of just cute to us in the modern day, but to the 1910 audiences, it was cutting razor-sharp satire that demonstrated the line between the haves and the have-nots is so razor-thin that it takes little to upend it all. There's also the idea that the aristocrat's affections were entirely tied to the ability of the butler to provide for her personally after her own power sunk to the bottom of the sea, and her love was in fact completely conditional. Even though they fall in love on the island, a return to society instantly tears the two apart once more. Despite DeMille's attempt to kind of sugarcoat the conclusion, there is this bittersweetness to it all. The fact of the matter was that society could easily reverse itself. Gloria Swanson was already DeMille mainstay by this point, having starred in multiple of his films, but this was the movie that catapulted her into sex symbol status. There is a scene that sees her hanging out with a jungle cat in a replica of the painting The Lion's Bride, I think it's called, complete with her wearing a exposing sexy metal bikini or something. George Lucas, did you happen to steal from Cecil? Did you? Let's be honest. In all seriousness, I find it funny, but not all that surprising that this kind of happened twice. So why did I put this at my number one? Because it's just damn entertaining. Sharp satire, DeMille in his silent prime, and pushing social boundaries. This, above everything, reflects the changing times of the 1920s, and a sign that DeMille was a force to be reckoned with. More often than not, it sometimes is just the best and most entertaining story wins. And with that, we're going to conclude the 1919s. But more importantly, we're going to conclude the entire 1910s as a decade full of innovation, exploration of the feature art form, and the solidification of film as America's great contribution to world art. There's so much more yet to come, and so much to discover, and I can't wait to see more. Thank you for watching. I will return to more modern movie analysis and historical film flashbacks. As always, keep those reels turning. Thank you.